This joint session of the New York State Legislature will come to order. His Excellency, the Governor of the State of New York.
Governor Krupczak, Speaker Steingart, your honorable bodies, we begin today the highest deliberations of a free people. The ceremonies and celebrations of recent days are now a prelude. In this chamber, in this arena, we confront the deepest and most difficult problems of 1/10 of the American nation. Seldom has an American legislature met with a greater challenge or a greater obligation before it. Sudden storms have swept across our economy and all of American life, shattering our hopes and our illusions of comfort, and the storms do not abate. Albert Schweitzer has told us that truth has no special time. It's ours now, always. Nonetheless, this is a special time in the life of New York State, a special time for our people, a special time for us as public officials, a special time for truth. Accordingly, I will not present to this body of such well-informed men and women the usual inventory and catalog of statements from the various executive departments. Even the printed message, which supplements this statement, will concentrate on my view of the central problems before us and the directions which I intend to take to meet them. All we say and all we do is shaped by two harsh facts. One is that the nation is in deep economic difficulty. The second is that New York State suffers more than its full share of the nation's travail. The State Council of Economic Advisors told us just 3 weeks ago that New York's unemployment and business activity have been in decline for the past 5 years. In New York City, and in particular upstate areas, the Council finds that the economy is in genuine stagnation. Unemployment is rising every day. Thus, New York would be in difficulty were these the best of national times. And even a better turn in the national climate, should it come, could not answer our fundamental economic problems. Nevertheless, we must help to shelter our people from the worst of the national storm. We can help to alleviate some of the worst effects of inflation. We can assure that the consumer gets a dollar's value for every dollar spent. We can assist our farmers and help our people to obtain adequate food at a reasonable price. Within the constraints of national policy, we can act to conserve fuel, to ensure that electricity is available to those who need it at the best possible price. Above all, by a proper self-discipline, we can halt and defeat the largest component of inflation, the undue escalation of state and local taxation. More than this, many of our most serious problems are not created by Washington at all. These will yield only to the work of our own hands and the labor of our own hearts. To care for the old and poor, sick among us, to protect our people from crime and violence, ensure that justice is done in our courts, to preserve our farms and woodlands and waters, to end every vestige of discrimination, whether racial, religious, sexual, or ethnic, in the operation of government itself. All these are our responsibility, not just a government responsibility, but yours and mine. These things we can do, and we will. Every purpose, every goal, every achievement we seek rests in the first instance on a sound and effective state government. The first truth, central to every problem we must confront, is that the government of New York State is in need of strong action to avert financial crisis. In the very simplest of terms, this government and we as a people have been living far beyond our means. What we did was limited only by our imagination and our desire. Our buildings were the tallest and most sumptuous. Our civil servants the most highly trained and paid. Our public assistance programs the most expensive. Thus, our taxes also became the highest in the nation, and every interest and group and advocate came to think of the state budget and of the state subsidy of local budgets as a never-ending horn of plenty that could pay for more and more each year. Now, the times of plenty, the days of wine and roses are over, so we must first recognize the immediate burdens we inherit. We do this not in a spirit of recrimination, nor in the criticism of any man or party. There is responsibility enough to go around for all of us. But if we would master our fate, we must first acknowledge our condition. The fact is that the last budget of the previous administration was balanced only by the most technical sense, by deferring into the first budget of this administration hundreds of millions of dollars of expenditures. In the last year alone, the state payroll has increased by 10,000 persons. New retirement obligations were assumed by the state university system, will now appear in the budget for the first time. Increased local government spending in the current fiscal year must be reimbursed by the state in the fiscal year that begins on the first day of April. Further mandated increases in the local assistance formulae threaten to add hundreds of millions to the budget. Wage and benefit increases requested by state employees could add more hundreds of millions. Coming on top of what is already the largest state budget in the nation, these new obligations leave us to face an enormous budget gap, an excess of projected expenditures over expected revenues. The exact dimensions are as yet incomplete, but one thing is sure: whatever its size, there is a marked and substantial difference between what we can expect to take in and what we are expected to pay out for the approaching fiscal year. The full dimension of the problem will be more certain by the time the budget is presented next month. However, knowing that the problem exists today, we will move today to meet it. Accordingly, I have ordered that there will be an immediate freeze on state hiring for the balance of the fiscal year. I urge that every local government adopt a similar freeze in every area, save only the most vital expenditures for public health and safety. However, immediate economies for the balance of this year are but an introduction to what is required for the coming year and for the future of state government. In the year ahead, I invite you to join with us in what I intend should be the most searching and critical review of state and local government and all programs and expenditures that we've had in a generation. Item by item, line by line, there will be a thorough review of every taxpayer's dollar we budget. The first budget of this administration must be presented within 3 weeks before the full re-examination I intend can be completed. As to this budget, we begin with the fundamental fact that we must close the immense gap we now face between our resources and our current programs, and there are only 2 ways to do it. First is to raise revenues, which means taxes. Over 40% of the state's total personal income is absorbed by income, Social Security, and sales and property taxes. Particularly as it affects the poor and the hardworking middle classes, this is an unsupportable and confiscatory burden. This tax burden is especially inequitable because so great a portion of it is in the regressive sales tax, in which some parts of the state now we take 8 cents out of a dollar spent by even the poorest family. Over the long run, we will undertake a fundamental re-examination of the entire state and local tax structure to to raise needed revenues more fairly and productively. To meet the financial emergency of this fiscal year, we must immediately raise certain taxes on those more fortunate and able to pay, as well as taxes on certain activities. With a single exception, however, I intend these new taxes as temporary measures only, pending the full review of state and local programs that will be carried on during the coming year. And even in the present, in this emergency, we cannot, and I pledge that we will not, increase the sales tax rate or income taxes on the great majority of our citizens. Therefore, much of this year's budget gap and preponderance in the following year must be closed by cuts in the cost of government, not cosmetic, not painless excisions into waste, although all waste must be eliminated, but deep and hurtful cuts into cherished programs, affecting thousands of government employees and hundreds of thousands of citizens. I did not become governor of this state to preside over the dismantling of its government or of all the programs to help those in need, for which we have struggled these last 15 years and more. But a government without self-control can do nothing and help no one. Nor can we allow ourselves to be trapped in the mere defensive maintenance of programs, however well-intentioned, that have long since outlived their effectiveness. We will therefore affect three kinds of economies. One, inefficient, wasteful, and low-priority programs will be excised from the budget for the state activities altogether. Two, every department of the state government must learn to run more efficiently, to carry out its full mission at sharply reduced expense. The sum of these two means savings from the budget bequeathed to us by the outgoing administration, and they will be substantial. For those activities and programs over which I have control, there will be a reduction, measured in real dollars, of 10% from the budget of the previous administration. I believe this will be the first time in history that a budget for state purpose expenditures will be lower in real terms than the budget for the previous year. Three, the remaining area that must be reduced is the state's assistance to local government activities. Any effort to cut the cost of government in the state would be futile if it did not address the local assistance, which represents 70% of the entire state budget. I will therefore, in this session of the legislature, send appropriate amendments to the laws governing state reimbursement formula, including those governing education, Medicare, and public assistance. Amendments of the educational formula to fully reflect the decline of enrollment in many areas and to move toward a true enrollment formula generally is only one example. For the budget I will shortly present, the state is required by law to reimburse the expenditures of local authorities according to the existing formula. I intend, therefore, to consider state support to localities on a 2-year basis. Assuming that present economic conditions continue, my local assistance budget for 1976-77 will incorporate necessary economies for both 1975-76 and 1976-77. I therefore appeal to every local spending authority now receiving funds under a reimbursement formula to voluntarily cut its budget to the maximum extent possible this year, applying the savings to the far leaner budget that we must all face in the year that will follow. How these economies ought to be effected is a matter for the informed wisdom of the local authorities. What is absolutely required is that the economies be made. We will work with local authorities to solve the difficulties we share. We will attempt to help with special problems, such as those faced by many cities in the wake of the decision of the Court of Appeals in the Hurd case last year. But all our efforts cannot and must not obscure the essential fact that Albany cannot solve every immediate local problem, nor is this a temporary condition. We must all live by the rule of austerity for as far ahead as we can see. This administration cannot and will not crush the taxpayers to support unwarranted increases in local budgets when the budget of every household in the state is in itself under stringency. The savings must be up to you. In this regard, the mayors of New York City and Buffalo, two men steeped in the tradition of the municipal service, have taken the lead with courage and foresight. The necessary economies I have outlined will affect every citizen. The most erudite professor at the state university, the recipient of public assistance, and those who work for government throughout the state. But the great burden of the hardship will not be allowed to fall on those whose suffering is already a blight on our society, an enduring rebuke to our conscience. So each of us will suffer some inconvenience or make some sacrifice. And therefore I will need the closest support and cooperation of every member of this body. No Democrat can object to the overwhelming need for economy, nor can any Republican object to attending the basic necessities of life for our people. There is not a member here without some cherished project of importance to his locality or constituency. But even as you represent your own constituency in Albany, so I ask that you also represent the general interest of the state to your constituencies. Only in that way can the necessary budget changes we must accomplish be made comprehensible and acceptable to our people, and the state be preserved as the embodiment of our best purposes. Necessary as it may be, cutting a budget is not a program. There is much that must be done in this state. It is to these matters that I now turn with you. The first need is for reform, searching and fundamental, in the institutions of government itself. If there was one mandate given by the voters to many of those in this chamber, myself included, it was to cleanse out the corridors of government once and for all. And all that remains is for us to act. First, as to the courts, I will shortly issue an executive order setting forth procedures to ensure that all judges appointed by me will be subjected to the most rigorous screening and evaluation for their quality and qualifications. No new judges will be appointed before that order is issued. More importantly, I urge the early enactment of a constitutional amendment providing for appointment of judges by the governor under a merit system. I urge speedy enactment of the amendment already proposed to facilitate the discipline and removal of judges. Pending passage of that amendment, I fully support the Temporary Commission on Judicial Conduct created last year. Finally, I will await neither new legislation nor the actions of others to exercise the full power of my office. Whenever it appears appropriate, I will request the Chief Judge to convene the court on the judiciary to remove judges who, whether by reason of incompetence, impropriety, or simple refusal to work, are not fulfilling their responsibilities. Second, as to the executive departments, I intend to eliminate entirely the plague of no-show commissions and bodies simply and directly. Unnecessary commissions will be eliminated from the budget. Those that perform a needed function will be maintained, but under new circumstances. No longer will anyone receive full-time pay for part-time work. I shall also require, by executive order, the fullest and most rigorous disclosure of the financial interest of policy-making officials. Appropriate elements of this information will be made public. No high official is drafted or compelled to serve. We are all volunteers, and these are now the minimum requirements for public service in the state of New York. I will also eliminate duplicative and unnecessary offices. State agencies will operate from Albany, not from offices that happen to be convenient for their commissioners. The capital of this state is not New York City or elsewhere. The capital of New York is Albany. I shall be here. I shall work here, and so shall the government of this state. Third, as to the Senate and Assembly, I have spent my political life in a legislature. I know how fiercely and properly you guard your independence, but I urge you to impose on yourselves the same kind of rigorous disclosure and ethical rules I have ordered the executive departments, as well as comparable economies. In this regard, I will offer legislation for your most serious consideration. Fourth, as to political campaigns, one area in which we cannot afford not to act is to provide widely based public support for political campaigns. Every elected official in this chamber, myself included, knows how destructive it is of the political process and how demeaning it is to those who participate in it for candidates to beg campaign funds from large contributors, too many of whom anticipate that government will do for them more than they have done for government. Accordingly, I will propose to the legislature an amendment to the income tax law, granting to every taxpayer a credit against his state income tax for political contributions up to $10 a year. This will be coupled with rigorous new limits on large contributions, and I will use every resource at the governor's command to ensure that the laws are enforced. It has become common to speak of challenging the system by which political power serves private greed. I do not challenge it. I declare that for this government in New York State, the system is over. The second great need is for drastic improvement in the entire process of criminal law enforcement. Crime may once have been far away from many of us. Perhaps some of us once held a desperate delusion that the poison which wastes the children of Harlem would not sooner or later come round into our own. That day is over. We should act against crime, if only for the sake of the poor, who are its preeminent victims. We must act against it for the sake of every man and woman and child among us. I am aware that law enforcement has been primarily a local matter, and so it will remain. But the laws prescribing criminal conduct are laws of this state. You are charged with their enactment, and I have sworn to see that they are faithfully executed. I accept that responsibility, as every man and woman in this chamber must do, in the fullest sense of the word. When we see a report that a 7-year-old girl has been thrown from a rooftop, or an 80-year-old grandmother beaten and robbed of a few pennies, or a mother shot before the eyes of her young son, we must say, that is our responsibility, that is our fault. We must say this not because we have caused the imperfections of human character, but because the responsibility is the inevitable companion of power. To say that it is not our fault would also be say that we have no power to change conditions that we all know are intolerable. I choose not impotence, but responsibility. Therefore, I announce the following immediate steps. First, every agency of the criminal justice system, courts, prosecutors, police, probation, and corrections will be subject to constant and rigorous monitoring of its performance. When performance is not satisfactory, I will exercise my full power, whether to convene the court on judiciary or to remove and replace other officers to ensure that performance improves. In this connection, I am informed there are many hundreds of homicide cases in which the defendant has been awaiting trial for over a year. Such delays strike at the very heart of our sense of fairness and justice. They invite unconscionable abuses of plea bargaining that make a mockery of effective law enforcement. Therefore, as a first step, I hereby request a report from every district attorney in the state on every case on homicide now awaiting trial for more than a year, together with the reasons why it has not already been tried, and what steps are going to be taken to move it to trial. Second, we already spend massive funds on law enforcement. I shall insist that they be spent far more effectively and in a unified and balanced fashion. Corrections, parole, and probation agencies will be overhauled across this state. And one of the few areas in my budget which will increase present spending is our assistance to the process of criminal prosecution, court parts, prosecution, and defense attorneys. Third, I will insist upon the most rigorous enforcement of the laws protecting citizens from the violent acts of others. There must be explicit and timely sanctions against those who commit crimes with firearms and other lethal weapons. If inadequate sentences continue to be imposed, I will seek new legislation establishing sentencing procedures to assure certainty of imprisonment. Fourth, I am directing the Department of Mental Hygiene to give immediate priority to its facilities for the confinement and treatment of violent juveniles. A 15-year-old killer may be too young to send to prison, but he is too dangerous to return to the streets. Fifth, corruption in the process of law enforcement and government is an intolerable cancer. Government cannot expect to enforce the law among its citizens if it cannot or will not enforce the law against its own agents and agencies. I will shortly appoint a special prosecutor to coordinate investigation of possible criminal violations regarding nursing homes. I will work with the state's district attorneys to ensure that any case involving abuse of the law enforcement and government process receives the utmost priority for investigation and prosecution where necessary. I am also directing the temporary State Commission of Investigation to report to me by July 1st on the condition of the criminal justice system in this state, across this state, and without delay. These are only initial steps. A complete program will be presented at an early date. Meanwhile, these measures, which are valuable in themselves, will also demonstrate the new first principles of law enforcement in this state. No citizen, no peace officer will any longer walk the streets alone. We will walk this road together. I am in this fight to stay. We are all consumers. We eat, we buy or rent shelter. We use the services of others. We are also workers and merchants, products and traders. Words like economic justice and consumerism, therefore, do not describe a struggle against faraway, unknown interests. They express the fact that we share a common society and a common fate. And there will be much more said about all of these matters in detail in the printed message. But I want to, today, come to you with a kind of message that means that we're going to work together and we're going to achieve and overcome every challenge facing this state. These are difficult times for the entire nation. Money may often be short, but imagination, effort, and compassion will be in constant supply. Texas may have more land. California has more people. But New York is and remains the Empire State because of our people, their unquenchable energy and fire, their creativity and quick intelligence, their indomitable spirit in the face of adversity. These are the riches of New York State. This is the state of immigrants. This is the state of those who persevere. All of these things that face us now are in the backdrop and the background of the great tradition of this state. We can do this as a state. You and I can do it as servants of a great people. In recent weeks, a Congress of one party has elevated to the presidency and vice presidency the members of another. Surely we can draw from that example a model for our own cooperation in the difficult days ahead. You are an equal and independent branch of government, compelled by circumstance and duty to reconcile the great conflicting philosophies of our great parties. If we can ignore the temptation of present applause or advantage, we can meet the stern duties and injunctions to community and compassion that are before us. We will then have won the gratitude of every man and woman in this state, now and in the future. As Robert Kennedy once told us, there is no more noble ambition or rarer prize for a public man. And even though we act in Albany, we may instruct the efforts of those in other states who also seek measures and programs adequate to withstand the swift torrent of change, demand, and danger that is engulfing every state in this nation. New York will need leadership. You and I must provide leadership. And then New York will ascend again to its rightful place as the first among 50 states. Let's go to work. Thank you.
I adjourn it. I adjourn it, then you go back to as soon as it is.